I'm excited to share some words of Torah with us based on this Parshat Terumah, which we heard read so beautifully, which details all of these elements of the Mishkan, the tabernacle that will house God's presence. Thank you, Harold, for the chat introduction. The center of the summer camp where I worked for 8 years, Camp Ramah in the Rockies, which is in a small piece of wilderness in Colorado, we had this small building called the Lodge. It was built in the 1960s by the Girl Scout camp that existed on the land before our camp began. It was a brown painted structure on the outside. The floorboards were bare on the inside. There were a pair of giant antlers hung above the center entrance of the lodge, above 3 concrete steps. The lodge was the nucleus of camp. It was the center of everything. Everything happened there. Everything came back to the lodge. On the first floor, we had the director's office. On the second floor, we had the education and camper care offices. And one year, there was even a spare bedroom for guests and the only flush toilet in all of the camp property, except for at the director's private cabin. We built our kitchen on this structure, and we built our Hadar Ochel, the dining hall, off of the main floor. We even had this room called the dish pit, Shtifat Kelim, in which all community members and guests were expected to help out. We had this beautiful wraparound porch with views of the valley below and a terribly damp and cold, bare concrete basement, which served as our staff lounge. It was also the mail center, all the administrative offices, the center for packing and unpacking gear before and after a wilderness expeditions. I actually helped construct this Hadar Ochel, which was the first addition to the lodge, which was an extremely haphazard endeavor, which is a story for an entirely other day. In 2012, we assembled this giant skeleton of a metal frame, and we stretched canvas over it and lifted it up and plugged it into these big metal sockets. And it was kind of like a wedding tent, but it always stood from year to year through snow and rain. And it was by no means a perfect structure. The dining hall would always flood when it rained, and it was very loud and crowded, horrible acoustics. And the lodge is what I like to call a palimpsest. It's this thing that we just kept adding on to. So as camp grew, we built more and more. What was once the food storage and food prep room as part of the kitchen was repurposed into another dining hall so we could fit everyone. The kitchen was expanded with a walk-in freezer and a fridge, and still the lodge was always the center of camp. And then, in the summer of 2017, the only summer that I left camp early, the lodge burned down in an electrical fire. Thank God no people were injured, but the center of our camp was gone. And this happened with about 10 days left of camp, and camp could not exist without this structure. We couldn't eat, couldn't make calls, couldn't do anything. So all that was left of our lodge, with 10 days left of camp, was rubble and the 3 concrete steps. Hearing this news in New York was devastating. This thing that I had built with my own hands had fallen, and the center of our camp was gone. The entire camp had to evacuate to a different Jewish camp in Colorado, where we carried out the last few days of camp. By the next summer, a new structure was built in a different location, and this time it was built not by the staff, but by a trained construction crew, which was much safer. And the center of our camp was still gone the next summer, and I felt the loss very strongly. I kept thinking of the lodge as I read this week's Parsha, which is about a community of people in the wilderness building a small structure. But this time, it is not for a hippie Jewish camp in Colorado, but for God. Parshat Terumah details how the Israelites built the tabernacle that would house God's presence. We see the verse, Exodus 25, verse 8. Ve'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham. And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell among them. But if God is everywhere, on the mountaintops and in our homes and in our hearts, why does God need a physical place to dwell, a little box? It seems both impossible and unnecessary. Looking at the verse as a whole, we would think that because the word mishkan is a singular male noun, the last word of the verse should read, betocho, I will dwell in it, referring to the physical structure. But the plural ending betocham, I will dwell in or among them, suggests that God won't actually dwell in the structure itself, but among the people who build it. God is the creator of our bodies, but also exists in our souls and in the prayers that come from our mouths. So why did the Israelites build this structure, and why does the Torah care so much about the process by which it was built? So I want to suggest 3 reasons for why the Mishkan was built and why it is important for the Israelites as a nation. The first is it required us to be invested in something. In order to be in community with one another and with God, the Israelites have to give something up. I wonder what it felt like for the Israelites to give of their treasured possessions, the few things they were able to take with them out of Egypt. Their yarns, their precious metals, cloth, tanned skins, jewels, wood. I wonder what it felt like to contribute towards something that was not ordered by a slave master and not going to be inhabited by the people who rule over you once it's completed. I wonder what it felt like to see these earthly objects become a sacred space for God. In donating these objects toward the construction of this small masterpiece, the Israelites become invested in bringing God's presence into their midst. They value the Mishkan because they participated in creating it. The second verse of the Parsha explicitly states that this investment is voluntary. It's not a tax for all people, and it's not even a commandment. Instead, people should give all that they brought with them out of Egypt, asher yidbenu libam, courting out of the generosity of their hearts. To be invested, we are asked to give something up and put it toward a greater purpose. The second reason why the Mishkan is important is because we value the things that we make. We take pride in the things that we build, even if it's a frustrating process or actually isn't worth something monetarily, like a piece of folded origami, let's say. At the end of the day, we take pride in the work of our hands. The effort that we put into something does not just change the object. It changes us and the way we evaluate that object. The challenge of creating fosters a responsibility. The greater the labor, the greater the love for what we have made. The Mishkan was such a project. The labor was about valuing God and about valuing holiness with prized possessions, time, and careful labor. The fact that the Torah dedicates several chapters to the dimensions, materials, and steps of this construction tells us as readers of the Torah that the process of building the Mishkan is just as important as the final product itself. We learn the process and understand the labor in order to understand and love what the Israelites made. The project required them to show their love for God. So we have investment and we value what we make. And the third, and I believe most important element for why we built the Mishkan is that it marks a shift in the Israelites' freedom. For most of the book of Exodus, the Israelites have been recipients of God's powers and creations. Everything that they experienced was God-given. The plagues, the splitting of the Red Sea, manna, water coming out of rocks, being led by a pillar throughout the wilderness so they'll know where to go. We get the sense at times that they're ungrateful or whiny as a group. The Torah is not coming down the mountain fast enough, and the manna, like, we're kind of sick of it. It's repetitive. We want to go back to Egypt and have the foods that we were used to. And this changes when the Israelites are required to be actors for the first time as they begin to build the Mishkan. They're asked to take responsibility for something. And it was the first project they undertook together. It forced them to come together by co-creating and by taking their scattered voices and molding some kind of harmony amidst this chaos of wandering in the desert. They were free from slavery, but what were they free for? God gave them the opportunity to answer this question by giving them the opportunity to give. Giving this opportunity to the Israelites gave them a chance to give back to God some of what God gave them. They did the creative and detailed work as a gift to God and as a commitment to holiness. Building the Mishkan allowed the Israelites to grow up, to become partners in creation and take hold of holiness and bring it to them rather than waiting for miracles to happen. Investment, valuing what we make, and receiving the opportunity to give for the first time after they were freed from Egypt. This is what forming a community and a nation looks like. In modern Hebrew, when we speak about donating to an organization like giving tzedakah, we use the verb litrom. It is the basis for the name of this week's parsha, Terumah. We can easily translate the word terumah as a contribution or a donation, but it actually has a different meaning without an easy translation. Some linguists or biblical scholars believe that it means something that you lift up by dedicating it to a sacred cause. In 2012, when we built the Hadar Ochel section of the lodge, a team of 20 of us, like I said, just lifted up this giant steel frame under which hundreds of campers and counselors would eat. We sang Birkat Hamazon and danced late into Friday night under this structure. That dining hall, at times, that Hadar Ochel, felt like the closest space to a Mishkan that I have ever known. It was a holy place that invited God's presence and generated holiness. And it was temporary. The Mishkan was also temporary. The tabernacle was long replaced by the temple, and then the temple by the synagogue. But our task remains unchanged. This responsibility to give and to bring God's presence into the world among us. This is the secret of giving, of Terumah. When we lift something to give to, when we give, we lift something, and it is we ourselves who are lifted. May this parsha inspire us to build together and give together, so that we may uplift God and uplift one another. Shabbat Shalom.